Hey, it's Matt here with Rackform. So thank you so much for the confirmation in the email. I just didn't recognize that email address before, and so we always want to make sure that if we're providing installation assistance, that we know who we're working with, whether it's a longtime user or a new user. And so obviously you're a new user, so I want to take us through the process of how we perform the installation. Now, before I get started, I will actually point us to a couple really important resources. The first one is rackforms.com, and then documentation, and we have this Rackforms install guide. And this page is incredibly important because it actually has a video here which shows us exactly how we perform a Rackforms installation. And what this video will actually do for us is this will take us through the exact same process that I'm about to do right now. And so in my email reply here, I'm just going to go ahead and paste this link in here for you, and I'm going to put a little heading called install video, because again, if nothing else, this will show you a slightly different version of this, but really important that we have this. Now, we do have the written installation guide, which is a very comprehensive look at this entire process, but usually that's not necessary. We just want to watch this video right here. That said, let's get started. Actually, sorry, one other thing. So you've mentioned a couple times now that you don't have SSL on your server. So SSL has nothing to do with Rackforms, and that's a good thing. We don't care from the Rackforms side if we're running on a SSL-enabled server or not. Literally has no effect whatsoever on Rackforms. And so I will admit it's a little bit hard to kind of parse your question, because you're saying, for example, in your first email, I've downloaded the Rackforms 6 beta. I don't have SSL on my server. How do I disable SSL install on my localhost? And so installing on localhost is something I'm going to show you right now. But again, the SSL has nothing to do with this process. So you don't need to disable or enable SSL to install on localhost. Again, like we're about to do, is something that is going to follow this exact process right here. So maybe what we can do, if you don't mind, is again, using the video link that I have in the email, and through this video, we can give this a shot. And then if you're still having problems getting Rackforms running on a local machine, just let me know. Okay, so first things first then, the most important thing that we want to do when we perform an installation of Rackforms is, of course, grab the Rackforms install files. Now, I don't actually have the beta right here, though the process is the exact same, right, between these two versions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and extract the Rackforms files into a folder somewhere on my local web server. And again, here I'm actually using on my Mac just the default web server that's built in. However, I have already set up a site called Build. So this Build site right here, if we actually go to this, can be accessed just by typing Build. And when I do this, that is, in other words, when I have a server, my local server set up so that when I use the host name Build, it is pointing to this proper website right here. Now, I suppose it may not hurt just to go into some of the specifics of how Apache is set up. Though again, I'm going to do this very quickly because it's actually going to vary depending on what operating system you have and so on. But basically, in my current setup right here, as a matter of fact, hold on one sec here. I'm gonna, so basically, in my current setup right here, in etc Apache 2, I have essentially my HTTP config. And then I have within this, I have a folder called extras, and extra has my my virtual host file. So if I do a nano and basically open up HTTP vhosts, I can basically scroll through this document, and I basically have where is Build? There it is. I basically have an entry for this virtual host right here. So this is how I'm getting this to work. So basically I'm saying here's a virtual host, its server name is Build, and then within the document root then I have a folder under users Gradenic documents htdocs build, and you'll recognize that as this right here, htdocs build. That's where I'm telling the server to go. And so setting up the virtual host here is, again, something I'm going to glance over quickly right now because it's actually a pretty involved process. But that's something that you can easily find documentation for on Google in terms of how do you set up a virtual server on, or a virtual host on your server. At any rate, that said, and by the way, actually, let me show you one other resource here that will be useful for this. I believe we have a written installation guide for a localhost install. Let me see here. Yeah, here it is. So this right here, I'm going to point you to this as well. You'll notice that this is kind of the same thing here. local install is, again, literally what we're about to do here. So it's broken into different steps. So I have the hosts file. So we're going to go ahead and set up the host file. Then we're going to set up the configuring Apache. That's what we just looked at. And again, I'll have you read through this right here, but this is, again, something that should take you step by step through the process. At any rate, when we have all that set up, in other words, we're pointing our local server at a location like we are right here. The next step then is to basically start the install process. But before we can do that, or really before we hit the install button right here, we do want to set up our database. And so the database process is something that, again, is going to vary depending on what database you're using. RACforms supports MySQL and MS-SQL and Postgres, so it's going to kind of depend. But basically what you want to set up is you want to set up your database server on your local machine so you have a database that you can access using a username and password. Now in my case, I have a database called Build, and Build has a username of Build and a password of Build. So if I actually go to my RACforms install right here, I can say your database name is Build, the username is Build, and the password is test. Then I'm just going to set up a very simple username and password of just test and test, and I'm going to put in my info@RACforms email address right here. So after all that's set up, in other words, I know that my database is called Build. Oh, and by the way, there's one other thing that we might need to do too. So your host value right here should just be localhost, though depending on how you have your database server, sometimes you actually need to set up something more specific. So you'll notice when I roll over this field, I get a little tooltip right there. I recommend reading through that just in case you don't get this. But basically, because I know the setting is correct right here, when I press the install button, RACforms is going to go through and it's going to install those database tables to this current location. So if I actually refresh the tables on here now, these are all the files that make up the RACforms installation. And that's basically it then. Usually the next step then is I'd actually go into my my folders right here. As a matter of fact, let me close this window and go back to Build. I will usually take the install file and I'll just rename it to something like install-1. And then I can go back to this and I can click here to log in. And then I can use test and test to log in. And we should be set right here. So again, it's a pretty simple process once you've done it a couple times. I've done it hundreds of times, but hopefully you'll agree here that really it's just about those two main steps. The first is setting up your server so that it accepts a local connections. And again, this documentation page, RACforms install guide, and then this localhost installation guide is super, super important because again, it takes us through all the specific steps for that. And again, it ends with the video tour here as well. So not only do we get a really complete reading of this, which is actually going to talk us through both Windows and Mac, it's also going to give us a video at the end as well. But as soon as we have our server set up, then the next step is to get our database set up. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. Again, lots of different software. Typically, because I'm on a Mac, I use a program called SQL Pro, so SEQUEL Pro. And SQL Pro is what this is right here, and this allows you to set up users really easily, and then as long as you have a proper user set up, during that install process, again, as we saw, it's pretty darn easy to go in there and just, again, fill out those the properties in the installer screen to get everything to work. But again, that's a quick overview. Again, I cannot stress this enough that SSL literally has nothing at all to do with RACforms. SSL is just a layer on top of HTTP. You'll notice sites like RACforms.com do in fact use SSL. And in fact, if we try to access the site without SSL, we just redirect. But this has nothing at all to do with the underlying site. It's just that on top of our connection, we're just basically saying, I want everything to go through SSL. And so you kind of set that up on your server. But again, there's no reason why you need to enable or disable SSL to make RACforms run. RACforms, again, just to be absolutely clear, does not care about whether you're using SSL or not. It just wants a server that has a host name that we can run, a database where we can put its tables, and of course a file system where the permissions are set up properly so that RACforms can write form files and write to the two configuration files right here, config.php, and move files, config.php. But again, you really don't need to know about any of that stuff. It's really just those steps that are outlined in the documentation. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I will anxiously await your response though, because again, for right now, I just consider this the first overview, and then whatever you have in terms of questions after this, please let me know. We'll absolutely dive right back in and make sure you get installed as quickly as possible.